The date was January 12, 1888. By mid-afternoon, the thermometer outside the Dawson County Land Office had already dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit minus 8 degrees Celsius. That was cold, but not alarming. Not yet. Men had seen cold before on the northern plains. They'd buried cattle, stacked extra cordwood, patched gaps in barn walls with rags and river mud. Cold was part of the contract out here. Cold was something you managed. What came next was something else entirely. Within 2 hours, a pressure wall of Arctic air collapsed southward across the Dakota Territory with no warning and almost no precedent. Temperatures fell 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius in under 60 minutes. The wind, which had been a steady northwest breath all morning, became a 60-mile-per-hour wall of white. Visibility dropped to zero. Men who had been walking between buildings 100 yards apart could not find their way back. The sky and the ground became the same color, the same blindness. This was a schoolhouse blizzard, so named because hundreds of children were caught inside one-room schoolhouses across the plains when the storm hit without warning. Dozens never made it home. Cattle froze standing in their tracks, legs locked in the position they'd last moved, hoarfrost crusting their nostrils before they even had time to turn their backs to the wind. Across Dawson County that night, the losses were staggering. Wooden barns, the good ones, the ones built with milled lumber hauled in from Bismarck or Fargo at considerable expense, failed within hours. The walls were too thin, the cracks too many, the wind pressure too relentless. Internal temperatures inside standard plank-imposed structures dropped to within a few degrees of the outside air. Horses were found dead, still tied to their stalls. Hogs froze in clusters in the corners of their pens. Ranchers who had invested years of income into their herds woke the next morning to silence where there should have been sound, stillness where there should have been breath. Every barn in the county lost animals that night. Every barn but one. On the western edge of a 320-acre claim off the Yellowstone Bench, where a rancher named Walt Gruber had spent most of the previous autumn doing something his neighbors had considered at best eccentric, and at worst a waste of perfectly good hay, a strange domed structure stood in the dark. It was roughly the shape of a half-buried melon. It had no windows. It had no iron stove, no woodpile stacked outside, no chimney. Just a low, narrow tunnel entrance facing southeast, away from prevailing northwest wind, and a small vent opening at the very top of its crown, no wider than a man's fist. Inside, 11 head of cattle stood packed together in the dry dark. Their breath rose in slow, visible clouds, and then, instead of vanishing into cold air, it gathered, circulated, and stayed. By morning, when Walt Gruber dug out the entrance tunnel with a coal shovel and crawled inside with a lantern and a thermometer he'd borrowed from the county extension office the previous October, the internal temperature read 34 degrees Fahrenheit 1 degree Celsius. Outside, the air was minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit minus 41 degrees Celsius. A 75-degree difference. Sustained for 11 hours. With no fire. This is the story of how that was possible, and why almost nobody believed it would work until the night it saved everything Walt Gruber had. If you've never heard of a hay igloo, you're not alone. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'll keep bringing you the engineering secrets the frontier left behind. To understand what Walt Gruber built, you have to understand what he was building against. The northern plains in the 1880s were not a forgiving place to run cattle. The land itself was extraordinary, vast, open, wind-swept grassland that stretched from the Missouri River breaks all the way to the foothills of the Rockies. In summer, the buffalo grass grew thick and nutritious, and the sky went on forever in every direction. Men who came out from Ohio or Pennsylvania or Germany looked at that sky and believed they could build something permanent here. Something that would last. What the land literature didn't mention, what the railroad pamphlets printed in St. Paul and Chicago carefully left out, was the winter. Winter on the northern plains was not like winter in the Midwest. It was not a season of inconvenience. It was a geological force. Arctic air masses descended from Canada with almost no geographic obstruction, traveling for 1,000 miles across flat terrain before hitting the Dakota ranches with their full, unbroken momentum. Wind chills that pushed effective temperatures below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit minus 51 degrees Celsius were not rare events. They were the baseline expectation for January and February. A mild winter meant you only lost 15% of your herd. A bad one could take half. Walt Gruber had come to Dawson County in 1881, part of the second wave of homesteaders who arrived after the Northern Pacific Railroad pushed its line through the Yellowstone Valley. He was 34 years old, a practical man from eastern Iowa with no formal education past the 8th grade and a working knowledge of horses, soil, and weather that had been earned the hard way. He filed his 160-acre claim, later expanded to 320 under the Timber Culture Act, and started with 12 head of mixed shorthorn cattle and a dugout shelter for himself carved into the south-facing bank of a dry coulee. His first winter was survivable. His second was harder. His third, the winter of 1883 to 84, killed 4 of his cattle and left 2 others, so weakened they never fully recovered. The cause, as near as Walt could diagnose it, was not cold alone. It was exposure. His plank barn, a standard post and beam structure, 16 feet by 24, sided with 1-inch mill pine boards, leaked heat from every joint. The wind found every gap. He burned through a cord and a half of cottonwood that winter, keeping the barn marginally above freezing, and he still lost animals. He was not alone in this. Every rancher in the county faced the same problem. The standard solution of the era was more wood, heavier walls, tighter construction. Men who could afford ordered double-wall construction with a gap between the inner and outer boards meant to be filled with sawdust or hay, an early, improvised form of insulation that worked reasonably well when done carefully, and leaked heat catastrophically when done in haste, which was most of the time. The materials were expensive. The skilled labor was scarce. And even the best-built plank barn in Dawson County was, by modern thermal standards, a near-total failure. A thin skin wood against an Arctic knife. What nobody had yet seriously considered, not in Dawson County, not in most of the American West, was whether wood was the right material at all. Walt Gruber started asking that question in the fall of 1885. Not loudly, not as a theory or a declaration, just quietly, the way a practical man asks questions, by watching and by remembering things he hadn't known were important. The mathematics of frontier heating were, in their own brutal way, a kind of sentence. A standard rancher's barn on the northern plains in the 1880s. Let's use the most common form. A single-wall plank structure 16 feet wide, 24 feet long, and 10 feet to the ridgeline, had a total wall and roof surface area of roughly 1,100 square feet. 1-inch pine boards, even dry and tightly fitted, offer an insulation value approximately R 1.25 per inch of thickness. In practice, with gaps at joints, knotholes, and the constant expansion and contraction of green lumber in extreme temperature swings, the effective R value of the average frontier barn wall dropped closer to R 0.8 to R 1.0. What that meant, in terms that Walt Gruber and his neighbors understood intuitively, if not mathematically, was this. In a 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 33 degrees Celsius temperature differential, say 0 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius inside, a barn of that size was losing heat at a rate that required roughly 1 cord of cottonwood every 18 to 22 days just to maintain marginally survivable conditions for the animals inside. A cord of cottonwood in Dawson County in 1885 cost between $3 and $5 to cut, haul, and stack, if you had a woodlot within reasonable distance. Most ranchers didn't. The Yellowstone Valley had cottonwood along the river bottom, but the upland claims were treeless. Men were hauling with 10, 15, even 20 miles by wagon across frozen ground just to feed their barn stoves. In a bad winter, 6 to 8 weeks of sustained extreme cold, a rancher might burn through 4 or 5 cords, keeping a single barn from becoming a death trap. That was money. That was labor. And still, it often wasn't enough. Local accounts from Custer and Dawson counties during the winters of 1880 through 1887 describe a recurring and dispiriting pattern. The wood ran short, the fire went out in the early morning hours, and by the time the rancher woke and crossed the yard to check on his animals, the temperature inside the barn had dropped below what the weakest animals could survive. Calves were the most vulnerable. Foals, animals already thin from the lean hay of a dry summer. They died in the cold not because the rancher was careless, but because the structure around them was incapable of holding warmth long enough to matter. The barn wasn't shelter. It was a delay. Walt Gruber understood this in his bones by the winter of 1885. He'd run the numbers in his own rough way, not with formulas, but with the accumulated ledger of winters survived and winters lost. He'd watched his neighbor, Calvin Price, add a second wall to his barn in the fall of 1884, stuffing the cavity between the boards with meadow hay and river-bottom cattail fluff, and seen Calvin's cattle come through the following winter in noticeably better shape than his own. That observation mattered. It planted something. Insulation was a variable, not the stove, not the size of the fire. The capacity of the structure itself to hold the heat that was already inside it. That was what determined survival. A fire, no matter how hot, was a losing proposition if the heat it produced escaped faster than it was generated. You weren't heating a barn. You were chasing a temperature that kept running away from you. The question that began to form in Walt's mind was quiet and radical at the same time. What if he built the wall first, and worried about the fire second, or didn't worry about a fire at all? Walt Gruber was not a man given to sudden inspiration. He was the kind of man who sat with a problem for a long time before he spoke about it, who chewed on an idea the way he chewed on a stem of switchgrass, slow and steady, tasting it from different angles before deciding what it was. His wife, Mabel, would say years later that she always knew when Walt was working on something, because he got quieter than usual, which was saying something, because Walt Gruber was already one of the quietest men in Dawson County. What he was working on in the fall of 1885 and through the spring and summer of 1886 was a problem of heat retention, and the answer he was beginning to think he'd found in the most ordinary place imaginable: prairie dog towns. There were several large colonies on the Gruber claim and on the adjacent public land to the north. In summer, the mounds were active and obvious, hundreds of small earthen volcanoes dotting the flats, animals chirping and diving and popping back up in their endless, alert routine. But it was in winter that Walt had started to notice something. On mornings when the air temperature outside was at or below zero, he had walked through the edges of the nearest colony and observed, more than once, that the earth immediately around the burrow openings was not frozen solid. The soil within 6 or 8 inches of an active burrow entrance was measurably softer than the surrounding ground, and on still mornings he could see the faintest trace of vapor rising from the largest holes. The colony was generating heat. Not much. Not enough to feel on your hand, unless you got very close, but enough to keep the immediate earth around the burrow entrance from freezing at the same rate as the open ground. Walt knew, in the general way that any man who'd lived on the plains for 5 years knew, that prairie dogs hibernated in winter. What he was seeing was not the animal's body heat directly. What he was seeing was the insulating effect of the burrow system itself. Packed earth, narrow tunnels, small chambers, a geometry that trapped and circulated whatever residual warmth existed inside and gave it almost nowhere to go. The earth was the insulation. The shape was the engineering. He thought about that for a long time. He also thought about something he'd noticed 2 winters earlier, in the hard January of 1884. After a blizzard had buried his south haystack under 4 feet of drifted snow, he'd gone to dig it out and discovered that the hay inside the drift, the bales he'd packed in tight the previous September, was not only dry but faintly warm to the touch. Not warm the way a living animal is warm. Warm the way a wool blanket is warm after you've slept under it. A retained warmth, borrowing heat from somewhere and refusing to give it back. He pulled a handful of loose hay from the center of the buried stack and held it against his cheek in the cold air. It was, he would later tell Calvin Price, warmer than his own hand. Dry hay, tightly packed, is an extraordinarily effective insulator. The physics of this is straightforward. Hay is roughly 80 to 90% trapped air by volume. Air, when it cannot move, when it is caught in the millions of tiny chambers formed by interlocking grass stems, conducts heat at an extremely low rate. Dry hay achieves an insulation value of approximately R, 2.7 to R, 3.3 per inch of thickness, depending on density and moisture content. A wall of tightly packed hay bales 4 feet deep, 48 inches, carries an effective insulation value somewhere between R 130 and R 160. To put that in context, a modern well-insulated residential wall typically achieves R 13 to R 21. Walt Gruber didn't know those numbers. But he knew what his cheek had told him in the cold January air, holding that fistful of hay against his face. And he knew what the prairie dog's burros were telling him every morning when he crossed the flats to check the stock tank. The idea that formed slowly, without drama, in the quiet of his own reasoning, was not complicated. It was almost embarrassingly simple. Build the wall thick enough, shape it correctly, pack it tight enough, and you don't need a fire. The animals themselves, 11 head of cattle, each generating between 1,000 and 1,500 BTUs of body heat per hour, would be the stove. The hay would be the furnace walls. The dome would be the geometry that kept the rising warm air from stratifying uselessly at the ceiling, and instead circulated it gently back down through the space where the animals stood. By September of 1886, Walt Gruber had started to build, before we get to how he put all together, and what his neighbors had to say about it. Make sure you liked this video and subscribed. We've got more stories of frontier engineering coming that you won't want to miss. And drop a comment below. Have you ever seen anything like this built on a working ranch? The first thing Walt Gruber did was choose a site. That decision alone told you something about the quality of his thinking. Most men, building a shelter for livestock, chose whatever flat ground was closest to the house and within easy reach of the water source. Convenience was the logic. Walt chose differently. He spent 3 mornings in late September walking the western edge of his claim, studying the way the wind moved across the bench. He watched where the snow had drifted the previous winter, which draws filled first, which ridgeline stayed scoured, where the ground stayed driest longest into fall. He found a shallow rise, barely 4 feet above the surrounding flats, with natural drainage falling away to the south and east. The prevailing winter wind in Dawson County came from the northwest. On this rise, that wind would pass over the top of a low structure without catching it broadside. He drove a stake into ground at the center of his chosen site on the 1st of October, 1886. The design he had worked out, partly from observation, partly from the internal logic of his own reasoning, and partly, oral accounts suggest, from a conversation the previous spring with an older Meader's rancher named Augustine Delorme, who ran cattle along the Yellowstone breaks, was a flattened dome, not a true hemisphere, which would have been structurally difficult to build with bales alone, but a low, wide mound with a profile closer to an inverted bowl, broad at the base, gently curving upward to a crown roughly 7 feet above the floor at the center. The interior diameter was 18 feet, enough to comfortably shelter 11 to 14 head of cattle with room to turn and lie down without crowding. The walls were the key. Walt had spent the summer putting up hay with one specific goal beyond winter feed: density. He wanted bales packed tighter than normal, compressed harder than he typically bothered with for simple storage. He'd built a crude bale press from 2 planks and a length of chain, and he'd use it all summer, wiring each bale with 2 strands of twisted iron wire rather than the single strand most men used. By October, he had roughly 240 bales stacked under a tarp near the building site, each one approximately 16 inches high, 18 inches wide, and 36 inches long, weighing between 60 and 70 pounds. He began stacking from the outside in, laying the first course directly on the ground, no foundation by design, because the frozen earth itself would serve as a floor, and angling each successive course slightly inward as the wall rose. Following the curve of the dome, he'd trace in the dirt with a stick and a length of rope used as a compass. The outer face of the wall at its base was 4 feet thick, 2 bales deep, stacked with their long axes running perpendicular to the wall face, so that the full 36-inch length of each bale ran through the wall from outside to inside. This was not accidental. Walt understood in practical terms that a bale oriented with its length running to the wall gave you the maximum depth of insulation between the cold outside air and the warm interior. 36 inches of packed hay, plus the compressed faces of the bales on either side, for a total insulation depth at the base of the wall of approximately 48 inches. At 4 feet of tightly packed dry hay, that wall was, thermally speaking, almost impenetrable. The entrance was a tunnel, not a door. Walt cut and shaped it into the southeast face of the structure, the side least exposed to the prevailing northwest wind, with a length of roughly 6 feet in a cross-section just wide enough for a full-grown steer to enter without difficulty, about 30 inches wide, 54 inches high. He framed the tunnel opening with a few rough cottonwood poles he'd hauled from the river bottom, not for structural support, but to keep the bale faces from crumbling inward under the pressure of animals pushing through. The tunnel's length was intentional. 6 feet of hay-walled passage meant that even when the outer opening was unobstructed, the cold air entering from outside had to travel the full length of the tunnel, losing temperature to the surrounding hay mass the entire way, before it could reach the main chamber. The vent at the crown was the final element, and in some ways the most considered one. Walt had seen, in his own plank barn, how warm air rose to the ceiling and stayed there, a thin layer of survivable warm 6 feet off the ground, while the animal's feet and legs stood in cold that was often 10 to 15 degrees colder than what a thermometer hung at human chest height would record. The warm air stratified. It sat uselessly at the top of the space, while the animals suffered at the bottom. The dome geometry addressed this directly. In a curved space, rising warm air follows the interior surface upward toward the crown, rather than spreading flat across a horizontal ceiling. At the crown, Walt left a vent opening, approximately 4 inches in diameter, pluggable with a twist of hay when not needed, that allowed the small amount of moisture-laden air accumulating at the top to escape. This prevented condensation from soaking the interior bale faces. It also created a gentle, passive convection cycle. Warm, moist air rose and exited at the crown. Drier, slightly cooler air was drawn into the tunnel at floor level, where it was immediately warmed by contact with the cattle and began to cycle again. It was, in its essentials, a breathing structure, a system, not just a pile of hay. Walt finished the outer shell in 11 days, working mostly alone, with Calvin Price helping on 3 of those days. He drove his 11 cattle into the tunnel on the evening of October 22nd, 1886, blocked the tunnel entrance loosely with 2 bales set on end, and went inside his house to wait for winter. Word spread the way word always spread in a county of 300 homesteads, through women at the trading post, through men comparing notes at the stock tank, through the particular social velocity of community where everyone's business was, by necessity, everyone else's business. What people were saying about Walt Gruber's structure ranged from mildly skeptical to openly contemptuous. The most common objection was fire. A hay structure was, in the minds of most experienced ranchers, simply a pile of fuel waiting for a spark. One lightning strike, one lantern knocked over by a restless animal, one ember carried on the wind from a distant prairie fire, and the whole thing would go up in seconds, with 11 cattle trapped inside a tunnel too narrow to let them all out in time. The image was not pleasant. Men who raised this objection were not wrong to raise it, and Walt knew it. He had thought about it. His answer, which he offered only when pressed, and without particular force, was that he didn't intend to bring a lantern inside, didn't intend to shoe horses in there, and that a structure with no internal heat source had, by definition, nothing inside it to generate a spark. The fire risk was real. He had simply decided it was manageable with care, and that the alternative, another winter of burning, he didn't have to heat a barn that didn't work, carried its own risks that people seemed less inclined to talk about. The second objection was structural. Experienced builders, men who had put up post and beam barns and knew the forces that a plains winter could generate, looked at the dome and saw a snow load problem. A wet, heavy snowfall sitting on top of that curved surface would compress the upper bales, they argued, and eventually the whole thing would slump inward. Some said it would collapse within the first month. One man, a carpenter from Minnesota, named Rupert Gage, who had built several barns in the county, told Calvin Price that he'd give it until Christmas at the outside before the crown caved in. Rupert Gage was not an unreasonable man. His concern was structurally logical for a flat or gabled roof. What he and the others were not fully accounting for was the geometry of the dome itself. An arch or dome transfers compressive load outward and downward along the curve rather than bearing it vertically at a single point. The wider the base and the more evenly the load is distributed across the surface, which a uniform snow cover does almost perfectly, the more efficiently the structure handles that weight. The Roman engineers who built the Pantheon understood this. The Inuit who built snow igloos understood it in practice without the vocabulary of structural mechanics. Walt Gruber understood it because he had watched a winter's worth of snowdrift accumulate on his buried haystack and compress the bales on top without collapsing the stack beneath. A regional newspaper per accounts preserved in the Dawson County Historical Archive, ran a short, sardonic item in its November 1886 edition describing the structure as, in the paper's phrasing, an eccentric experiment in bovine accommodation that local ranchers regard with equal parts curiosity and concern. The item noted not unkindly that Mr. Gruber was a capable and industrious settler whose novel approach to winter shelter would be tested by the coming season in ways that words could not anticipate. Walt read the item at the trading post. He folded the paper, set it down, paid for his flour and salt, and drove his wagon home without saying anything about it to anyone. He checked the tunnel entrance that evening. The bales he'd set as a loose door were still in place. From inside, he could hear the quiet, low sound of 11 cattle breathing in the dark, a sound that, to a rancher, is one of the most reassuring sounds in the world. Slow breath, calm animals, a space that felt, even from outside the entrance, noticeably different from the air on the open plain. Not warmer. Exactly. Not yet. The season hadn't turned hard enough for the difference to be dramatic, but different, stiller, as if the air inside had agreed to stay. The winter of 1887 to 88 announced itself early and settled in with a patience that felt almost deliberate. November brought a series of hard freezes that locked the Yellowstone tributaries by the third week of the month, 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the typical freeze date recorded at the land office in Miles City. December was brutal in a sustained, grinding way, temperatures rarely climbing above 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius even at midday, overnight lows regularly hitting minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 29 degrees Celsius and below. The kind of cold that killed slowly rather than dramatically, that wore down animals and people through exhaustion and feed consumption and the relentless small labors of keeping water from freezing and hay from bearing under successive storms. By the end of December, Calvin Price had lost 2 calves and 1 cow to cold stress. Rupert Gage, the carpenter who had given Walt structure until Christmas, had spent most of that month burning through his cordwood reserve at a rate he hadn't budgeted for. The standard plank barns of Dawson County were, as they always when a hard winter, performing their usual function, slowing the loss of heat but not stopping it, buying time, not saving it. Walt Gruber's 11 cattle were fine. He checked them morning and evening, crawling through the tunnel with a lantern held low, never bringing it inside the main chamber, and each time the pocket thermometer he begun carrying with him told the same story. Internal temperature of the hay igloo, even on the coldest December nights, held between 30 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 1 degree Celsius, to 3 degrees Celsius. That range was not comfortable by human standards. It was not a heated space. But for cattle in good condition with adequate hay, it was survivable and more than survivable. Walt's animals were eating normally, drinking from the tank he kept open each morning, and showing none of the distress signs, sunken flanks, rough coats, reluctance to move, that marked cattle in inadequate shelter. Then came January 12th. The schoolhouse blizzard struck the northern plains that afternoon with a ferocity that eyewitness accounts would struggle to adequately describe for years afterward. The temperature at the Miles City Land Office, recorded at 2 p.m., was 18 degrees Fahrenheit minus 8 degrees Celsius. By 4 p.m., it had dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit minus 30 degrees Celsius. By midnight, the official low recorded at the nearest weather station was minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit minus 41 degrees Celsius, with sustained winds of 58 miles per hour, producing a wind chill equivalent that no instrument of the era was designed to measure, but that survivors estimated, in oral accounts collected years later, as the most physically violent cold any of them had ever experienced. It was, by any measure, the worst single weather event in 85 years of recorded Northern Plains history. Across Dawson County, the losses that night and the following morning were catastrophic. Ranchers who had built to the standard of the era, men who had done everything right by the conventions of 1880s frontier construction, lost between 30 and 60% of their cattle herds. Wooden barns that had stood for years failed in a matter of hours as the wind-driven temperature differential overwhelmed whatever marginal insulation the walls had ever provided. Internal temperatures in standard plank structures dropped to within 5 to 8 degrees of the outside air. Animals that had been warm and calm at noon were dead or dying by midnight. Walt Gruber dug out his tunnel entrance at first light on January 13th. He had not slept. He had spent the night in his house listening to the wind and doing arithmetic in his head. The kind of arithmetic a man does when he's trying to calculate whether the thing he built is still standing, whether the animals he is responsible for are still alive, whether the idea that seemed so clear and logical in September still holds in the face of a storm that seemed designed to disprove it. He crawled through the tunnel with his thermometer. He did not bring a lantern. He didn't need to. Even before his eyes adjusted to the dark, he knew. He could hear them breathing. Slow, steady, the low, patient sound of cattle at rest. Not the tight, labored breath of cold-stressed animals, but the easy, unhurried rhythm of animals that are warm enough, fed enough, and undisturbed enough to simply exist without crisis. He held the thermometer at chest height in the center of the chamber and waited for it to stabilize. It read 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius. Outside, the air temperature that morning was minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 39 degrees Celsius. The differential was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained for 11 continuous hours, through the worst single night in living memory on the northern plains, with no fire, no stove, no external heat source of any kind. The only energy inputs were the body heat of 11 cattle, approximately 11,000 to 16,500 BTUs per hour collectively, and the thermal inertia of 240 tightly packed hay bales that had been absorbing and holding whatever warmth existed inside the structure since October. Calvin Price came over that afternoon, after the wind had dropped enough to make the crossing possible. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel for a long moment without speaking. Then he crawled inside and put his bare hand against the interior face of the nearest bale wall. He held it there for several seconds. "It's warm," he said when he came back out. Not a question. A fact he was still working on believing. Walt Gruber nodded. "Bales hold it," he said. "Same as the ground holds it. Same as the snow holds it. You just have to give it enough wall." Calvin looked out at the county, the white, still, catastrophically silent landscape of the morning after, and then back at the low dome of hay sitting on its rise, ordinary and intact, steam curling faintly from a crown vent. "How many did you lose?" Calvin asked. "None," Walt said. By the time the spring thaw broke the Yellowstone ice in April of 1888, the story of Walt Gruber's hay igloo had traveled well beyond Dawson County. Calvin Price built one the following September, not identical to Walt's, but close, adapted to his own site and his own herd size, a dome of slightly smaller diameter, 16 feet across, with a double tunnel entrance that Calvin had added on the theory that a longer approach corridor would slow the cold air infiltration even further. His records, preserved in a family journal now held by the Montana Historical Society, indicate that the internal temperature of his structure on the coldest night of the winter of 1888 to 89 held at 29 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius, marginally below freezing, but still 55 degrees warmer than the outside air. He lost no cattle that winter. 3 other ranches in the county had built variations of the structure by the fall of 1889. A homesteader named Delia Fontaine, who was running her late husband's claim alone with 2 hired hands, built a rectangular variation using the same bale wall principle, but with a low gable roof of stacked bales rather than a dome, a compromise she made because it was easier to build without help, and because her herd was too large for a single dome to shelter. Her version was less thermally efficient than Walt's by a meaningful margin. The gable geometry didn't circulate heat as effectively as a dome, and her wall depth was only 36 inches rather than 48, but it still dramatically outperformed the plank barn she had inherited from her husband, and it cost her nothing beyond the labor of stacking bales she already had. The technique spread not through publication or official recommendation, but through the oldest channel available on the frontier. Neighbor watching neighbor, and neighbor asking neighbor how they'd gotten through the winter with their animals intact. What Walt Gruber had built was not, in the final analysis, a primitive workaround. It was applied thermal science, executed with available materials, calibrated by observation, and refined by consequence. The principles he had worked out, without textbooks, without formal training, without any vocabulary beyond the practical, are the same principles that govern modern passive building design. Thermal mass, insulation depth, passive convection, geometric efficiency, the reduction of infiltration through extended entry corridors. Dry hay, as a building material, achieves an insulation value of approximately R 2.7 to R 3.3 per inch of thickness. At 48 inches of wall depth, 4 feet of tightly compressed bales, the effective insulation value of Walt's walls fell somewhere between R130 and R160. By comparison, a well-built modern residential wall with standard fiberglass batt insulation achieves R13 to R21. A wall built to current passive house standards in a cold climate targets R40 to R60. Walt's hay wall, built in 1886 by a man who had never heard the word R-value, exceeded modern passive house standards by a factor of 2 to 3. The dome geometry added another layer of engineering advantage that his neighbors intuited but couldn't fully articulate. A hemispherical or near-hemispherical structure minimizes the ratio of surface area to enclosed volume, meaning it loses heat through less surface per unit of interior space than any other three-dimensional form. A cube, by comparison, has roughly 24% more exterior surface area per unit of interior volume than a sphere of equivalent volume. Every square foot of exterior wall surface is a path for heat to escape. The dome, by its very shape, offered fewer paths. And the cattle themselves, 11 animals, each generating between 1,000 and 1,500 BTUs of body heat per hour, provided a combined heat output of roughly 11,000 to 16,500 BTUs per hour. That is, for reference, approximately equivalent to the heat output of a small electric space heater running continuously. In an insulated environment with an effective R value above R100, that modest, constant heat source was sufficient to maintain an interior temperature more than 70 degrees Fahrenheit above the exterior air temperature for 11 uninterrupted hours. No wood, no fire, no fuel cost, no labor beyond the stacking. The animals were the furnace. The hay was the furnace walls. And the man who built it was not an engineer. He was a rancher who would watch prairie dogs and remember what his hand felt like pressed against a buried haystack in January, and who had been quiet enough and patient enough to let that memory mean something. There is a particular kind of intelligence that the frontier produced in the men and women who survived it. Not the intelligence of laboratories or universities, but the intelligence of close attention paid over many years to the specific, unforgiving logic of a particular place. It was an intelligence that looked at a problem not and asked what the correct theoretical solution was, but what the available material could do, what the landscape was already doing, and how those two things might be made to work together. Walt Gruber didn't invent insulation. He didn't discover thermal mass. He didn't engineer the dome. All of those things have been understood in one form or another by builders in cold climates for thousands of years. From the sod houses of North Greenland to the bears of the Aleutian Islands to the earthen kivas of the American Southwest. What he did was look at his own ground, his own grass, his own winter, and see that the answer was already there, stacked in bales under a tarp, waiting to be shaped into something that would hold. That is a lesson the frontier keeps trying to teach us, in the stories of every rancher and homesteader and mountain man who solved a survival problem with what was already at hand. The most sophisticated engineering is often the engineering that looks the most obvious in hindsight, the solution that makes you wonder, when you finally see it, why it took anyone so long to try. Walt Gruber lived on his Dawson County claim until 1911. He built 2 more hay igloos over the course of his time there, each one a modest refinement of the first. His cattle never again suffered a catastrophic winter loss. The schoolhouse blizzard of 1888 is remembered today primarily for its human toll, the children and adults who died caught in the open when the storm struck without warning. It was a genuine tragedy, one of the worst single-day disasters in the history of the northern plains. But on one low rise in Dawson County on the morning of January 13th, 1888, a man crawled through a tunnel into a dark space full of warm, breathing cattle and held a thermometer up in the still air, and the number it showed him was a different kind of history. Small, quiet, and almost entirely forgotten. 34 degrees. No fire. All of them alive. If this story made you think differently about what primitive building really means, like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What frontier technique should we cover next? We've got stories from the Aleutian Islands, the Scottish Highlands, and the Appalachian backcountry that will change the way you think about staying warm. We'll see you in the next one. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.